Hi everyone, it's Nikki here, and today I wanted to talk a bit about when rules are not rules, or really conflicting rules within editing. Now this issue often occurs when we look at the divide between Australian, UK, US English. It came to mind to do a video on this because recently a friend of mine reblogged a blog post, or shared a blog post from someone who was complaining about their editor. It was quite an interesting scenario because I think I read through the blog post and I think there was a bit of blame on both sides. It sounded like the editor was being a bit intractable and perhaps didn't understand that there were different ways of doing things, but at the same time the author was declaring the editor's way was incorrect, that she'd looked it up and it was never done that way. And I know that's wrong because the way the editor was trying to do it is the way I personally would do it. If I were writing my own story based on how I was brought up to use this particular punctuation point. So I thought it would be handy just to do this quick video and just consider, maybe through an example, what I mean by this. As editors, we are obviously working with a set of rules, spelling rules, grammar rules. However, of course, we're only human and every editor will have their own personal preferences. For instance, my personal preference is very much for UK spelling because that's how I was brought up. However, if I'm writing for a US publisher, or if I'm editing for a US publisher, then I know that I just have to accept US spelling because either I want to get my book published with them or because I'm working with a US author who's of course going to want to keep their own spelling preferences. So part of being an editor is knowing all the different ways of doing things and being able to set aside your personal preference in order to work within the author's preferences or their needs. You know, it's no use changing all their spelling to English to UK English, I should say, if they're going to be submitting to a US publisher. So the interesting one I thought I'd talk about today is ellipses as an example. So in English, in the UK, the way I was brought up, an ellipsis, if it's a sentence that's almost just having a pause in the middle of the sentence then continuing on, we would do the ellipsis, the three dots, a space, and then continue. However, if it's the end of a sentence and he's kind of trailing off into nothing, we would use the ellipsis and then a full stop, and then a space and start the next sentence if there is one. That's completely different from how they do it in Australia. I recently edited a manuscript for an Australian author and I had to double check the Australian style guide to confirm I was doing it right, because they like to have a space before the ellipsis and a space after the ellipsis. And that is true whether it's starting a new sentence next or whether it's running on into like a continuation of the initial sentence. The only exception is beginning speech. If the ellipsis is the beginning of speech, they won't have a space between that initial speech mark and the start of the ellipsis. In the US, they do it differently again. In the US, if it's a sentence that's continuing, they don't have any spaces. The last word leads straight into the ellipsis, which leads straight into the next word. And if the ellipsis comes at the end of a sentence, they just have the ellipsis, no full stop, but just a single space and start the next sentence. So there we have three very different ways of using ellipsis. And none of them are wrong. And you can't turn around and say one's right and one's wrong. It depends on the market you're writing for, your upbringing, what you've been taught. And I think the difficulty is when either editors or authors or both, when it's even worse if both are like in opposition when working on edits, they both have very different ideas about which it should be. I mean, I used ellipsis as an example, but this occurs in many ways, things like spelling, placement of commas. You know, I grew up in a fairly comma-free environment, shall we say, using commas minimally as minimally as possible. But now I edit a lot of US works and I write for a US market, and the US like commas. And so when I'm writing one of my own stories, I have to think about where I'm putting commas, because otherwise the US editor's just going to come along and put a load in anyway, so I might as well just save time and put them in to begin with. And of course, if I'm editing a US work, I would be putting commas in different places than I would be if I were editing for an English author or a UK English author. So I think this comes down to a video I posted recently regarding how you work with your author, and it's all about setting up decisions early on. If I have an author, I like to know where they're from, and I start to look at their manuscript, and I'll look at consistency. For instance, toward versus towards. Now I'm English, I prefer towards with an S at the end. The US don't like the S. So if I've got an English author and I look through his manuscript, and 90% of the time he's got an S on towards, but there's 3 or 4 times when he doesn't, then I will assume that that is a typo, and I will add the S for consistency throughout. If it was a US author and he hasn't got an S on except in 2 places, then I would be taking that S off, because clearly his preference is without an S. He's writing for a US market and he's in the US, which generally doesn't like the S. And if there's a question on anything like this, it's best to ask the author up front. Just say to them, how do you want to do speech marks? How do you want to do your commas? How do you want to do your spellings on things like towards? If there's any doubt in your mind about which their preference is going to be, just ask them. I just email them and say, look, I've started this manuscript. This is what I'm thinking about doing with these commas. Does that suit what you want, or would you prefer me to do this? You set yourself up with a style guide, and it helps to write this down. As you're working through the manuscript, if you notice a particular spelling of something that the author always capitalises, jot down a note of that so that if you come across it again later on and it's in lowercase, you know that you need to capitalise that first letter. Working with style guides is really important, and you can develop those with the author if there is a single shred of doubt about which way something should go. And that will solve these problems, like the author in this blog post had, where it got to the end and the editor had made all these decisions and the author wasn't happy with them. And you can avoid all of that if you just talk it out from the beginning and set up a series of your own rules. Because we talk about editing rules, grammar rules all the time. And yes, they do exist. Of course, we can't all just be putting grammar wherever, or putting punctuation wherever we want. People used to in the old days, but in the last decades and last century or so, we've established rules for these things. So you don't just want to do it higgledy-piggledy, you want to make it consistent throughout the manuscript. But you just have to be aware in the back of your mind all the time, whether you're an author or the editor, that there are different rules in different places. And it's not that one place has got it right and all the rest are doing it wrong. You just have to accept, where's the author from, what market are they writing for, is it clear what their preferences are, and establish everything at the beginning, and you won't have any of these problems. So just remember, rules are important. We all work from rules as editors. However, you need to know which rules you're working with, because one rule is not better than another, and often there are several options from which you have to choose before you can properly edit a manuscript. So that was just a few comments, because this is something I've seen come up a couple of times, and having seen it again in this blog post recently, I thought it was something that was worth mentioning. Has anyone got any thoughts below? Have any of you had any issues of this sort of nature? How did you deal with them? I'd love to read your comments and get a bit of insight into how you developed your relationship with your editor or with your author, whichever way round we're talking about it. And I look forward to coming back and sharing some more thoughts with you again next month. Bye for now.